Welcome to the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue 2020. Thank you for joining today's discussion. It's the second in a series of 6 panels that is being hosted by the producers of the Berlin Energy and Transition Dialogue. My name is Geraldine Bastion, and I have the honor of moderating the series of debates on current energy-related topics. The topic of today is sustainable competition. So consumers around the world are increasingly demanding sustainable products that not only consider the raw materials and production methods, but also look at the energy use and transmission costs throughout the value chain and supply process. In order to meet this new demand, companies are turning to renewable energy in order to reduce their carbon footprint, in order to improve their CSR, and of course, to avoid the risk of rising electricity prices. Because as renewables are no longer simply competitive with conventional fuels, but actually also winning the price game. So as to how far is green energy provision and consumption therefore becoming a competitive advantage? That is what we want to be discussing today. And I'd like to introduce the 4 panelists that we have here with us to you now. Javiera Aldunate is the head of the International Office of the Chilean Ministry of Energy, which is responsible for strategically promoting the country's position in the energy field by fostering instances of relationships, agreements, and multinational collaborations, as well as preparing and developing exchange of experiences, policies, and programs together with other countries. Javiera, thank you so much for joining us today. Second, I would like to introduce Professor Miranda Schroers, whose main research areas are in international and comparative climate policy, environmental politics, and low and carbon energy transition. She is involved in projects examining the energy transitions in Germany and Japan, climate policies of Europe, the United States and China, and politics of high-level radioactive waste disposal. Welcome, Professor Schroers.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
The third panelist joining us today is Devaprio Das, who is the Senior Communications Advisor for Sustainable and Market Communications at Ørsted. He is responsible for strategic communications and media outreach toward climate and sustainable stakeholders. Ørsted is among the world's largest renewable energy companies with a portfolio of offshore, onshore, solar PV, and bioenergy plants, and is ranked the world's most sustainable company in the Global 100 Index. Devaprio previously worked at the corporate communications in the biotech sector as a journalist and covering economic and foreign affairs in Denmark, as well as in Uganda. And last but not least to this panel, I would like to introduce Philip Ellett, who studied industrial engineering, business administration, and economics with a minor in philosophy in Karlsruhe, Bonn, and Friedrichshafen, started his career at the regulatory strategy for Daimler in Stuttgart, and is currently working for the German Association of the Automotive Industry in Berlin as a manager for climate protection policy. The German Association of the Automotive Industry consists of more than 620 companies involved in production for the automotive industry in the Federal Republic of Germany. It's great to have you here joining this discussion today, Philip.
Thanks.
So we'd like to kick off our discussion by inviting each of our panelists to give a short opening statement before we join in a discussion together. The key question for the opening statement being, what does a green sustainable advantage actually mean? What does that mean to the industry that you're involved in or to the country that you're living in? And what role does renewable energy play in the topic of sustainable competition from your perspective? What are the key aspects? And to kick things off, I would like to open the floor by passing the word first to Javiera.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. I think this 2020 has been a turning point in the way we perceive the sustainable development. The unexpected pandemic somehow forced us to rethink not only our relation with the environment, but also the ways our societies want to project the social and economic development. The energy sector represents the base of our economies because it allows us to live our lives comfortably, to move, to work, and to produce the goods and the service we all need. That is the reason why the change of the paradigm going through this sector today is so crucial. We are having an extraordinary opportunity to build back better our economies and societies after the pandemic and to redesign a low carbon and green system starting from the grounds, which means from the way we produce and use energy. Today, the citizens are fully aware of the effects of the climate change, and it's claiming, both to the state and the private companies, regulatory and production commitments that will allow to achieve the crucial necessity of carbon neutrality. Renewable energies are the center of this process. We must start greening the primary energy matrix through the only way we have to do this, by exchanging the burning of fossil fuels, both for thermal and electric uses, with renewable sources. This approach applies to all the energy subsector, electric generation, transport, industry, and buildings. Greening our economies is not only a duty for our societies, but also a tremendous business opportunity for those companies who are looking at the future with the right kind of eyes.
Thank you so much, Javier. We're very curious to learn more about Chile's policies and endeavors in this direction during the course of the panel. If I may ask Miranda Schroers to go next, please.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think we're at a really exciting time with the renewable energy development. We are seeing many countries that have, in the last 10 to 15 years, really started to invest very heavily in the development of renewable energy, to the point that we have countries that are obtaining really substantial amounts of renewables these days in their electricity systems. In Germany, about half of the electricity now is coming from renewable energy, and that's really a dramatic change from what we saw 20 years ago, when it was really just a small percentage of electricity from renewables. And this story is repeated in country after country. We're seeing China, we're seeing Japan, we're seeing parts of the United States, and in many areas also in the developing world and transitioning world. India is now investing very heavily in renewables. So I think what we've seen is that renewables are now a recognized component of energy systems in a way that they were not in the past, with the exception of perhaps hydropower. But with the new renewables, we're really at a new stage here. We're at a stage where they are growing faster than any other form of energy use and development. And this puts countries in competition with each other. And so I think the topic of this session today is right on. It's perfect. It shows us that renewable energy is a business sector of the future. It means that companies need to think about how they're going to transition away from the energies of the past, the oil, the gas, the coal that they've been relying on. And it also means that those countries that have pioneered in the last years with the development of renewables now need to think about the next stage. And that's going to bring us thinking about how do we bring different sectors together. Mobility sector, which in the past has not been part of the renewables structure, or a heating sector, which, with the exception of maybe Norway and the other Scandinavian countries, heating has been based on gas, it's been based on oil. And with more and more countries experiencing hotter and hotter temperatures because of climate change, the cooling sector will also need to be addressed. Demand will be growing, and we need to find a way to deal with this because of climate change that pushes us in the direction of more renewables. So you're totally on target with this panel, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Miranda. And I'd like to invite Devaprio as the next speaker to give his statement.
Thank you, Geraldine, and also thank you for having me on this distinguished panel. Well, 2020 has been a momentous year for all the wrong reasons, but it has actually set two targets into hard relief. The first one is that we have only 10 years now, or less actually, to halve global carbon emissions by 2030. And the other goal is that we have, well, about 9 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And I mention this because actually business will play a critical role in propelling climate action to get us to the 2030 target, but it will also help us tremendously to get towards the SDGs. And that's because businesses the main way it can contribute is through providing sustainable and scalable, and by that I mean affordable solutions, which will help us to meet those goals. And if I just take the case of Ørsted, for example, 10 years ago, Ørsted was one of Europe's most polluting electric utilities, coal-fired, oil-greased. 10 years later, we've reduced our emissions by 86%. Well, actually, that's since 2006 baseline. And we're going to be carbon neutral in 2025. And we've set a target to have a carbon neutral supply chain by 2040. And just very recently, we had our science-based targets approved as being aligned with the 1.5 degrees pathway for global warming, which is what is needed if we are to actually keep carbon emissions, if we're going to keep carbon emissions and halve them by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. And 2020 has been momentous because it actually showed us that it can be done. Even though everything seemed to stop, the one thing that you could rely on in the first part of this year was renewable energy. It was dispatched first from the grid, because wind and solar are dispatched first from the grid before you dispatch from fossil fuel plants. And actually, the sector continued to grow at a healthy clip. In fact, as some of the other panelists have pointed out as well, the renewables today are actually outcompeting fossil fuels on price in about 2/3 of the world's countries. Offshore wind, for example, has dropped 66% in price, the electricity from offshore wind, in just the past 8 years. And this leads me to point to 3 things, which I want to just put here in my opening statement about what actually sustainable competition means for us at Ørsted. First of all, set ambitious targets for climate and for carbon reduction. This will help foster innovation throughout your supply chain to help bring down carbon emissions. Secondly, let's figure out how we can accelerate the build out of green energy in many markets and at large scale. And finally, let's figure out how do we ensure profitability and working in partnerships so that we can continue to draw finance towards the green energy transition. And this is some of the stuff I'd like to talk to you about a little bit more today during the rest of our panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip. Last but not least, thank you so much to Vaprio. Last but not least, I'd like to invite Philip to give his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Geraldine, and hello to everybody. It's a great pleasure to share the time on this panel, and it's good that we have this discussion because I think it's very important to talk about the future of the world and how we can introduce renewable electricity, renewable fuel, renewable energy in total. So what is our motivation as producers of cars, trucks, buses, and also providers of mobility? For us, a central pillar of our business case of most of our member companies relies on people being mobile, enjoying individual mobility, and also the mobility of goods and trucks hauling heavy stuff and all of that. And times are changing. In the past, it was enough to construct a vehicle that had a good quality and was reliable and had a good design, but that's not enough anymore. We are absolutely clear in our industry that mobility, individual mobility, has only got a future if we manage to transform it into a climate neutral and sustainable way. That is for us, it's an absolute must for our future development. So the quest in order to achieve this is basically how do we manage to get renewable energy into the car, into the production processes, in the entire ecosystem of mobility. And when we look at the past and knowing that most of the energy consumption in the automotive business happens during the use phase of the vehicle, we have, and Dr. Schroers pointed that out absolutely correctly, have only had a very small fraction of renewable energy, and that was mainly due to biofuels. We all know that there are barriers in expanding that for a good reason, and the next step that we're taking at the moment, and we're in a full move of transformation there, is electrifying our vehicles. We have very steep targets until 2030. We have huge challenges to overcome, but we're ready. We're investing billions of euros to achieve this. So we are seeing a clear way of electrification, which allows introducing renewable electricity in the mobility sector. For instance, from Germany, for instance, also from Denmark. So wind turbines from Denmark will be a very important energy provider for us. But we must not forget that there is also a huge ecosystem around the combustion engine, not only from our side, the production side, but also the demand side, the practical users of mobility. So there is no way around introducing renewable fuels and renewable energy for combustion engines. Studies have shown that without this technology, there won't be any climate targets that we can achieve in the mobility sector. So for that reason, we also have to find huge sources of renewable electricity, which can be transported in form of renewable fuels into our cars. And there, for instance, countries like Chile, and therefore I'm very happy that Javiera is here in our call. Countries like Chile or Morocco or Iceland will be very important in an international collaboration for this entire question of putting renewable energy into our vehicles. So I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much. And we shall kick that off now. I'd like to begin with the idea that I sort of posed in the beginning of part of the moderation, that consumer habits are changing and are changing quite rapidly. I was personally interested to read that Accenture conducted a study now during the Corona pandemic, looking at those different consumption habits, and found that in 15 countries across 5 continents, nearly half of consumers said that they're making more sustainable choices when they're shopping and are likely continue to do so. So it's a little bit of a refreshing thing to hear that in the middle of a global crisis, where I'm sure everybody's watching their wallets and what they're spending, people are thinking about sustainable consumption and are changing their habits. I'd like to ask you, Miranda Schroers, if you've been observing this kind of shift in consumer consumption habits to green products, and if you think it's true, this assumption that consumer awareness is also changing regarding the energy consumed to produce a product.
I think something we've seen in the last years particularly has been a very strong push from civil society demanding actually that much deeper climate action happens than has happened in the past. We've seen Fridays for Future, young students out on the streets demanding attention to climate change, in part because of their very real concerns about their future and well-founded concerns about their future. And we're also seeing, because of other environmental problems like plastics in the ocean or concerns about loss of biodiversity, that people really are waking up to what's happening on the planet. And this is also leading to changes in various areas, including consumption. So we're seeing much more attention, I think, emerging to how do we develop products in a way that they really are more sustainable, that we enter into systems of circular economy, meaning that all of the material inputs into the development of a product actually are used again, so that we don't actually, so we at the end don't have waste products. Waste is itself then seen as a product, a potential input into new products. And that also goes for energy. One of the things that we've had in the past are things like labeling for products that use sustainable wood or products that are using recyclable materials. But we haven't really had that yet for energy use. And I think something that we're going to see more demand for in the future is an understanding of what kind of energy has gone into this product that I'm using. And so we're at a new stage of thinking about product design throughout the whole value chain that looks at all of the resource inputs. Where do those resources come from? How are those resources produced? And that means not just the minerals or the natural resources that went into products, but also the energy resources. So I think we will see much more consumer awareness and demand in the coming years. Also, as we see changes in government policies and programs, the European Green Deal pushing for a big transformation. We're seeing possible changes in North America, depending on what happens in the US election. It could very well be that we will see a broader push towards more sustainability in North America as well. We're seeing the same thing in China. Big push because of population and environmental pressures to think newly about consumption, and green consumption, including green energy consumption, is going to become much bigger.
Thank you. It's good to hear you also mirroring that the fact that this is a global phenomenon and not just something that we're observing, for instance, in Europe. Devaprio, I would like to ask you next, and I'm hoping you would be able to take us on a little inside journey on how your client base perhaps is changing, your B2B clients, your industrial clients. Do you see a shift in who is demanding more renewable energy sources?
Yeah, I think Professor Schroers there actually raised some really interesting points. And I know the way I see it is that, energy is something you don't miss until you don't have it. When you turn on the switch and then the lights don't come on. And fortunately, B2B clients, they've figured that one out quite early, and they realized that sourcing renewable energy is a way to become competitive quickly, because it's one of the best things you can do to actually cut your carbon footprint is to source renewable energy. And that also means that the carbon footprint of the products that you manufacture automatically gets reduced or put to null. And what we have noticed is that, yes, there is a growing shift among businesses. Now, our footprint is mainly currently in Northwestern Europe, but it's also expanding to the US. And let me take one very recent example. We actually recently concluded what is the world's largest offshore wind power purchasing agreement in Taiwan with TSMC, which is the world's largest semiconductor manufacturer. And they were going to offtake 920 megawatts from an as yet unbuilt offshore wind farm in a place called Changhua in Taiwan. And this is incredible, not only because of the size of the deal, 920 megawatts, but also because it means that over time, over, say, the next decade, we will be helping to actually remove, annihilate emissions coming from a product that is used in practically every home. And sometimes in multiple devices in every home. I'm talking about semiconductors here. And this is something that consumers don't even need to think about. But the fact is that the businesses are doing the thinking for them and actually helping to cut out emissions on a very sort of tangible way every day from the lives of the consumer. Closer to home in Germany, actually, we concluded another PPA of roughly 100 megawatts with Covestro, which is an industrial maker of resins, polymers, and the like. It's based out of Germany, and that's also from a wind farm that's going to be built in the next couple of years in German offshore waters. And once again, helping to sort of green the supply chains of industry. So not only just selling the green products to consumers, but also to other businesses who are then manufacturing in a greener way.
Yes, those are two perfect examples for that. Thank you. And thereby also showing the impact that this is going to have if it's actually happening along the value chain and not just a marketing label stuck on an end product. So Philip, I'd like to bring you in next because you already elaborated a little bit how important renewable energy is in making the car drive and will be in future as well. But of course, we are interested also in the energy that goes into creating the car in the first place. So it would be great if you can elaborate a little bit more on the shift that's happening there in the automotive industry, whether it's happening and to what extent.
Yes. Well, I think it is a very important point to put renewable electricity or renewable energy into the car production. Generally, yes, but we have to keep in mind that this is a fraction of 10, maximum 30% of the energy consumption of the entire lifetime. So it is an important point, and if we are to reduce the footprint by 95% or even 100%, this is a quest that we have to tackle. But for us at the moment, the main field of interest is during the use phase, and that is also and actually mainly because of the current regulation. We have a regulation that sets very strict targets for the automotive industry in terms of what cars to produce, what the cars have to look like in terms of energy consumption and CO2 emissions. This is actually a very strong push for electrification because the current regulation accounts only the so-called tailpipe emissions, so only what comes out of the tailpipe of the car, and the entire rest of the car's lifespan is not considered. So for many car makers, doing something to tackle energy consumption and to tackle CO2 emissions and renewable electricity, renewable energy in production is, so to say, a private engagement. It is not at all or very little targeted by regulation. And from our perspective, that is generally a problem, that we're focusing only on this tank to wheel. We've gone a long way, and there's good reasons that we've done that in the past. But so far, our hands are cuffed on many occasions to do something. Nevertheless, many car makers are engaging. I want to point out, for example, VW. VW has got a very large power plant in Wolfsburg, their main facility that actually runs the entire city and provides a lot of electricity. And they have recently just done a fuel switch and got rid of the coal-fired installations and replaced it by gas, natural gas-driven installation, all out of their own money because they wanted to do something. And there's very little market force. If we had a regulation and a possibility that actually not only fostered but also incentivized the automotive industry more to be able to engage more for renewables, that would be of great help. But as always, it has to be embedded in the entire system. But at the end of the game, it's always a question of business models. We've seen this very clearly with the ETS, for instance. The fuel switch is spurred by the ETS, emission trading system in Europe. And we also see this with fossil prices and CO2 prices. And for example, raising the CO2 price in the industrial sector would clearly help achieving the application of renewable energy in the production phase as well. It has been said already, we have to think cross-sectoral. So combining the sectors and enabling the sectors to help each other, and always think in business cases, how we can actually put this on the road and get it working.
Thank you. And I'd like to dig into some of those regulatory topics you touched on a little bit deeper during the course of the discussion. But first, I'd like to bring in Javiera, as Chile was already mentioned as a country that would be an energy supplier also in future. And one reason for this is that Chile has put gigantic efforts into the promotion of renewable energies and extension to make sure that it hits carbon neutrality by 2050. And I think it's really impressive when one looks at your policies and the efforts that you've made in the recent years, Javier. Can you elaborate on that a little bit, perhaps, and how you're trying to really path that way for industrial renewable energy consumption?
Sure. Thank you very much, Geraldine. I think, first of all, it's clear that we have a new paradigm on the electric sector where users want to be actively involved, generating their own energy and solutions. So we have to ensure that our regulations, markets, and policies allow them to achieve that. In that sense, one of the challenges of a higher share behind the meter solution is how to properly pay the transmission and distribution grids that will be still needed to keep a secure system. To address that challenge, it is necessary to have a proper price signals based on the use of the transmission and the distribution segments instead of the energy consumption. We have like new policies that are really ambitious and going green like the fastest as we can. And it must be noticed that probably the future won't be 100% based on large scale generators or 100% based on behind the meter generation, but a mix between both solutions where we'll still need ways to keep a secure and resilient power grid, but also allows each user to have their own energy supply. To achieve that, we need to set a comprehensive regulatory framework that enable both solutions in order to develop this secure, efficient, and sustainable grid. And that's what we are working on. As you said, we want to be carbon neutral by 2050, and we're closing all our carbon industries by 2040. So the efforts of a small country are really, really big. So we're working on that. We're really ambitious. We're integrating different ways of generating energy in the grid, like hydrogen. We are really, really compelled by a new national strategy of hydrogen that will be launched in 2 weeks. So we're trying to do the things in the best way and also in a faster way.
Yeah, it's really impressive to hear. And as we're talking about sustainable competition, I would like to ask you, Javier, if you see that this policy and these efforts that you're making, how is that actually changing the competitive advantage of Chile? And how is Chile developing as a consequence of these efforts?
I think that as a small country, we're like taking a lead, and that's really, really like impressive and also exciting. The competition is changing all the sector. I think electricity providers are seeing how this is changing and how this is changing fast. And we have to build new policies, new regulation, and be like in the pace of these really, really fast changes. I think as the Dev says, 2020 have put us a really a more ambitious goal. So we have to work faster, as I said, and all the companies, I think they're seeing that if they're not sustainable or greener in the short term, they will be out. All the society is like looking at them and seeing what they're doing. So I think it's like a natural competition that if you want to stay in the market, you have to be sustainable, you have to be green, and you have to act really, really fast. So I think this, when you put yourself goals like being carbon neutral by 2050, makes all the companies have a goal that they have to achieve. That makes them like work together, work with the government, and also build regulatory frames that can make this happen and happen in an easier way.
Thank you. Miranda, I'm curious about your perspective on this topic. If renewable energy capacity is a competitive advantage for some countries, if we're looking at this from the perspective perhaps of also national or regional competitiveness, what does that mean for those countries that have fewer resources? How can they remain attractive as industry sites in future?
I think one of the things we've seen globally is that countries with few resources can nevertheless become world leaders. If you think about the fact that Germany imports so much of its resources, Japan, Korea, some of the leading countries, Taiwan, they have been import dependent and therefore moving towards a efficient, energy efficient, resource efficient, and renewable based system allows for a competitiveness that we've seen in the past, and it's expanding in new ways. But there are, of course, some countries that have better capacity for renewables than others. And if that's where your question is leading, I think the discussion about hydrogen fuels is also a very interesting one, because it becomes a way to think about how you can conceivably export and import renewables in a way that hasn't been possible in the past, partly because battery storage is still in a development stage, and the efficiency of batteries, although it's expanding and improving tremendously, is still not at a stage where we could, through batteries, have large export and import of energy. And thus there's this big interest now in development of hydrogen fuels. And I think that's something that we'll be seeing much more investment in the coming years, and much more competition between countries in the development of hydrogen fuels. Although here we need to also be careful, because there are different kinds of hydrogen fuels. There's those hydrogens that are based on renewables, and those that are based on traditional fossil fuels. And of course, here in Germany, we're very interested in how we can promote more green, renewable-based hydrogen fuel.
Yes, thank you, Miranda. That's a good point to advertise the first panel that we did in the series, which was in fact on green hydrogen energy sources and the possibilities to work on those in international collaborations as well. So if anybody's more interested in that topic, you can check out the recording of the first panel in this series. Looking at the example of Chile, I am wondering, why is it then that not more countries are following suit with stronger policies in this direction? Devaprio, do you have an idea? Is this just the lobbying power of the old energy sector, or why are other governments still heavily subsidizing fossil fuels?
Okay, that's a difficult question to answer. And I think a lot of it rides on the fact, like as Philip pointed out, there is a need to have leadership when it comes to the regulatory side. Governments need to, first of all, they need to be pushed by the private sector to take ambitious action, especially around, for example, nationally determined contributions for how to reduce carbon emissions. Companies can actually help their governments to set strong regulations that really ramp up their NDCs, and that has a trickle-down effect on companies themselves. But I think it's also to do with with individual geographies. I mean, you have to look at each country and see, well, what source of energy makes sense for them. Professor Schroers referred to that a little bit. Now, if you were in Norway, that's probably hydropower. I come from India. Solar has kind of kicked the legs out from everything else. Solar energy is going to be the bedrock of future renewables in India to a great extent, along with wind, both onshore and offshore. If you're in Denmark, well, last year we in Denmark, I'm based in Copenhagen, wind supplied 52% of the electric supply. That's kind of astonishing, more than half of the supply for a whole year. And I think that the reason why is it that countries aren't moving fast enough. I think for one thing, they need to see that it works out on cost terms. That is the cost out actually happening fast enough? Can they see a viable path towards the implementation of large-scale green energy infrastructure? They want to see a clear path, and they want to get that at the right price points. Some countries, such as Germany, have been absolute leaders, also Denmark, Sweden. They've had decades of good technology to support them along the way and good regulations as well. Other countries, such as China, are absolutely taking the lead now, shooting far ahead. If you look at the USA, it's a very interesting and mixed picture. One gets a little bit sidetracked looking at headlines such as the US pulling out of the Paris Accords, but that's misleading, because the US is in some ways actually 52 different countries. I mean, each state setting its own policy for energy, and some of the US states are far ahead of even individual countries, such as New York State, California State, who are setting very ambitious net zero targets. And by setting that really good policy, they're actually kickstarting a process whereby their own industries are setting their own targets, whether it's for automobiles, whether it's for energy generation, to try and make that policy actually come to life. So I think we need to actually go out there, even as a private sector, and show them that, yes, there are good examples out there. It is possible. There is a viable pathway to getting to large-scale renewable energy infrastructure at a fast rate. Taiwan is a very good model of actually doing that as well, to just take one example.
Thank you. So, Javier, do you think European countries should be taking much bolder steps when it comes to introducing policies similar to yours and supporting this green energy transition? What would be your key point of advice?
I think Geraldine is just not a will position. I think there are some countries as Chile that we're really, really fortunate that we have a tremendous capacity of renewables. We have the most big radiation in the north. We have the most strong winds in Patagonia. So we're taking advantage of that. And I think some countries cannot do that because they don't have that kind of capacity for renewables. So I think that the mission is to collaborate and have new ways to share these resources. That's why Chile is working on hydrogen, because we can produce the hydrogen as a really, really low cost, a green hydrogen, as Miranda said, and we need off-takers. So maybe that's a way as well to share a shift to green energies. we're going to produce a lot of green hydrogen. We are going to use it primarily on mining, which produces a lot of green, like CO2 for, but we also need off-takers that can make this market a big one. So I think we can share with other countries not only policies, regulation, examples, but also the resources that we have, but some other countries don't.
Thank you. I want to bring Philip back into the conversation, especially because we've touched on different points of regulation now, and you already made a strong call earlier on, which I thought was quite refreshing to hear in a way. Like from a consumer perspective, sometimes we've looked at self-commitment for such a long time in this industry and feel that's only going a certain way given the track record of recent years. So I'd like to invite you to elaborate a little bit on what you already mentioned earlier, saying that regulation incentivizing renewables would be a great thing, not just setting sort of stricter rules, but also giving a bit of a vision and idea and encouragement in which direction to go. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yes. I mean, what we see at the moment is a great inconsistency of different regulations in different countries, in different sectors. And this is creating a whole mess that actually hinders the definitely needed innovation and especially investment. We need investment, otherwise there won't be a change. And we have a discussion, for instance, in Germany, where people who advocate for protecting the environment think that the main lever is to reduce traffic. This is an approach that has never worked in the last decades. We see a lot of world markets where traffic is ever increasing, and people who want to buy their first car because they've never owned one, they will first want to have a car and then think about renewable energy for it. So we are seeing approaches mainly pursued by NGOs that are totally against an effective work for renewable energy. This is really a surprise to see this, because you'd think those people would actually do something for the environment. I think they are not. They're actually hindering businesses to invest, and they're creating a lot of inconsistency. If you look at the European Green Deal, we have a new target is being discussed of 55 to 60% reduction within 10 years. At the same time, here in Germany, the Ministry for Environment has presented their plan for the Renewable Energy Directive put into place in Germany. Do you know how much the target level of renewable energy in traffic is, in the transport sector is? 14%. It's ridiculous. We as industry, we as a car industry, we want to sell more cars. We advocated for 23%. We advocated for mandatory standards for hydrogen, mandatory standards for e-fuels coming, for instance, from Chile, Morocco, or somewhere else, to have an ecosystem of import and export of energy. And it was the environmental ministry in Germany who actually stopped this.
Why do you think this is?
This is a ridiculous situation.
I mean, I asked the question earlier to Deb whether this is the lobbying power of other entities that come in, but it's kind of hard to believe that there would be a greater lobbying power than the automotive industry. So why do you think this is?
Well, we do have a lot of contact with the oil industry. And I can tell you it's definitely not them. The oil industry is advocating for higher standards of renewable energy in the automotive and transport sector. And it is at the moment, it is environmentalists who say we have to change everything to electricity in the transport sector, which is actually a very dangerous strategy, because you're relying only on one technology, and you stop the possibility of introducing energy that comes from outside of Germany and its neighbor countries. I mean, it's very important to use energy in an efficient way and put it into electric cars. No question about that. But we know that the climate standards, climate targets will are not to be achieved with only this technology. We know that. And we will need to introduce imported energy in countries like Germany, which are very densely populated and very industry intensive. And because some people say we only have to go for electric first, efficiency first, they are stopping additional measures, and that will stop us achieving the climate targets.
So other panelists want to comment.
As that.
Sorry, thank you, Philip. I didn't mean to cut you off there. Devaprio, you wanted to comment on this.
Yeah, thank you. Just very briefly, I quite agree with Philip's position there. I mean, and I think even in the energy sector, in the renewable energy sector, it's very clear that everyone would agree that there needs to be a mix of technologies going forward. I mean, we're not going to get to net zero overnight. There's going to have to be a space for existing technologies. But I just want to put something on the table. Ørsted, it's my company, its market capitalization actually exceeded BP's 10 days ago at more than 59 billion euros. And this was a bit of a wake-up call, I think, in some ways for the energy majors. And we've seen them also this year, Shell and BP, for the first time actually talking about, large-scale divestment, not having high levels of shareholder dividends for the first time in almost their entire history. And I think we can see that even the oil industries, like Philip said, they're actually beginning to realize the value of renewables. That's one thing. The other thing is that, as Philip mentioned, there are also lots of competing interests, and very frankly, if we take renewable energy, that boils down to how do you use space? How do you use the land on which you put onshore wind turbines? How do you use the marine waters on which you put offshore wind turbines? And we actually see a fair degree of opposition from groups such as fishermen. And you might think one of the oldest industries in the world actually coming head-to-head with one of the most modern industries, offshore wind. And one has to really be conscious that, we have to find a way of sharing these natural resources appropriately. And I just want to put that out there, that I think the car industry is a good example, but I think many industries going forward are going to face that same challenge. How do you make more of natural resources in a time when competition for resources is increasing, and as we're trying to get away from a fossil-based model?
Thank you. Yes. Miranda, you also had a comment.
Yeah, I think we need to bring a couple of different things into the discussion. One was, and it might have been a bit of a language question, but the question about transport. I think it's fair that many consumers and individuals are saying we need to rethink our transport systems, partly because of the time and space that's being used with the current model, and it is really limiting a lot of people. And the pollution, of course, associated with the traditional automobile is a big, big problem. The question about the non-governmental organizations and the auto industry, I think we need to take in a somewhat broader context, because we have seen the automobile industry traditionally being a foot dragger on transformation away from the conventional engine and the use of fossil fuels. But what we're seeing now, which I think is a very good sign, is that starting to change. But I think where we do have to be careful, and this is, I think, what you're referring to with opposition from the non-governmental organizations, and that's also something Devaprio was mentioning. It's a question of how we go about developing renewables. And if it's the development of biofuels that is competing with biodiversity or land for agriculture, that is something that really needs to be considered. And we also need to be careful when hydrogen imports are coming from use of coal-fired power plants in other countries, then that's also not helping the climate change or the energy transition that we need. And so we need to look really at how do we go about making transitions that are going to be painful for many people. So we need to be thinking about how do we do an energy transition that's also a just transition. And there, I think we need to be thinking about not only the need for making a shift away from fossil fuels, but also helping those communities and those industries that are heavily impacted by this shift to come along and shift into new industries, new production ways, and to help people realize there can be a bright future in new kinds of energy-based products. But transitions are hard, and so we have to be careful that we don't lose people on the way.
Absolutely. And think about this as an inclusive and, as you also said earlier, global endeavor. For a closing perspective, I'd like to, on the one hand, look very practically what instruments, and you've already offered a lot of solutions and ideas, which is fantastic. Like, what instruments do we have at our hand now to drive this change? And then maybe a little bit of a glimpse into the future of how this could also be changing the world in terms of geographical power structures and alignments. So maybe for the practical now, instruments such as PPAs, are they enough to accelerate the expansion and production of renewable energy? Or maybe as a quick sort of flashlight, what other tools or mechanisms do you think are needed now? I'll throw that into the round. But if nobody jumps in it, then maybe DiFaprio.
Should I go first then? I think they are one of the best instruments we have currently. And what we keep stressing is that let's look to existing technologies and existing mechanisms and see how we can really roll them out at a high pace and in a scaled up way. So PPAs are here to stay, and they're going to grow in importance. The question is that how do we get more companies to see the relevance of instruments like PPAs? That's one thing. And maybe another suggestion is that what we're very keen on is how do we bring more mainstream investment into what we would call ESG investment, environmental, social governance focused investment, so that investors, when they look into their portfolios, they begin to think, okay, if I invest in companies with a green advantage or a green profile, I will actually get a better return. And as that storyline becomes more and more apparent for individual investors, for institutional investors, there will actually be a greater momentum towards bringing that cash towards green-focused industries. So that's something we could focus on as well.
Great, thank you. Would anybody else like to come in on that question, or any other suggestions on that point? Philip? Sorry.
I think the PPAs that you mentioned are one little brick in a whole big bunch of measures that we need. The PPAs might be a good tool to foster the application of renewable fuels, but it's just one very, very small fraction of what we need. What we need in general is an incentive for all the sectors and all the industries to go into renewables and to go into CO2-free, fossil-free forms of energy. And do this development hand in hand, and not have, as we do have at the moment, 50% reduction in the next 10 years in the automotive industry, 14% in the fuel industry. It doesn't go along. So we have to streamline this and go towards a zero fossil in 2050. I think this is the main idea. And on the way in this transition, what we need is a whole bunch of instruments. For instance, I'm just throwing in some ideas. Why is the tax, a fuel tax, based on if it's petrol or diesel? It could, for instance, be based on the fossil CO2 content, just as an idea. Why don't we have the same standards as we have for cars for renewable fuels? We're talking about banning the combustion engine. Actually, it makes no sense at all. What we should ban is fossil fuels, because if we fire a combustion engine with e-fuels, and by the way, I'm not advocating for expanding biofuels for a lot of reasons, but if we import e-fuels coming from Chile, for instance, and we put them in a combustion engine, there's no problem in terms of climate change and climate protection, because this is a climate neutral fuel. And I think we have to come away from looking at the car and looking at the whole system and how the energy can be transformed. And I think the transport sector could be a great, I like to call it a locomotive for this transition. Why? Because the mitigation cost in our sector is 10 to 100 times higher compared to other sectors. So in other words, we can pay for basically anything else. And if we use this economic power, for instance, by expanding an emission trading system across sectors, then the purchase and investment power can be transformed into sectors where at the moment there is no incentive for investment. And at the moment we're designing, or policy is designing all of those those silos, one sector by another, and not combining them. Of course, you can't just throw them together. That's for sure. You have to think about a transition phase, design that in a clever way, avoid carbon leakage. That's all for sure. But we have to think in systems to come to a sustainable world.
Thank you so much, Philip. You did a fantastic job just combining the very practical with a lot of great suggestions with the very visionary at the same time. So thank you for that. And Miranda, you also wanted to throw in some ideas.
Yeah, I think some things that are happening now, which are really exciting, we're starting to see more and more countries establish 2050 targets that are going in the direction of climate neutrality or even beyond climate neutrality and going into negative climate emissions. What we're also seeing are more and more regions that are starting to question any kind of reliance on coal. And so we're seeing more and more regions and countries that are arguing for coal phase out, and some that have already achieved that. The other thing we're starting to see is a bigger push to remove subsidies for fossil fuels, very central. Without removing fossil fuel subsidies, we are going to continue to see reliance on fossil fuels. Carbon pricing. The negative consequences of carbon need to be put into the price of that fossil fuel that we use so that people start to recognize the real costs of using carbon. You were mentioning the idea of PPAs, purchasing power agreements for renewable energy, and that is definitely something that needs more attention, especially in countries where we have reached a fairly high level of renewable energy, like in Germany, where we're starting to see a phase out of the feed-in tariff that was very, very important for the initial development of renewable energy. But the purchasing power agreements are a way for big investors to also invest in renewables, and for utilities and for companies to find solutions that are mutually attractive that can also help promote more renewables. I think that the idea of a mix is very, very important, but we do need to make sure when we look at the mix that we're also not allowing some sectors to be relaxed about what they're doing. And I think that's why we do have this push now towards sector-specific targets and performance monitoring. So I think what we're seeing is the beginning of a next very important phase that won't be easy, but it will also be exciting because it's going to open the doors for many new kinds of technological innovations, as well as many new kind of intersectoral innovations.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that positive outlook. I want to give you the closing word, Javier, and maybe connected to the question where this is heading, also in terms of what shifts we can expect this to bring in future. So do you think, like, down the longer line, we'll be seeing a shift to really locations, countries where renewable energy is provided, that will also be the places where goods are produced, IT services are hosted, professional services are delivered in future? Is that going to change some of the global power structures we're seeing at the moment?
Thank you, Geraldine. As I said before, I think collaboration is the key. Some countries have the renewables, some countries have the power for innovation. And so we have to make a mix. And I think that's the only way to move forward. And it's really nice to see that the agreement of the panel is that we need to achieve a greater proportion of cleaner energy. For example, PPA is important, but it's not the only way, and that's clear with all the comments of the panelists. And on one hand, that's because the planet cannot support our skyrocketing energy demand, expected to increase by 60% by 2040. So with traditional fossil fuels generation, without compromising an already in an already uncertain environment situation, we have to really improve sustainability and increase the decentralized renewable, and this is critical for the future of the planet, and not only for the companies, as I said before. First, there's the responsibility from governments to give the proper market signs, and so the companies can see the opportunity of going green as an attractive and profitable business. Also, the companies has to embrace this new Green Deal, and that's why it's such a radical importance to make a change and not see as a risk for their revenues. And I think at last, we need to achieve a responsibility to help all of us achieve the targets and incorporate sustainability into all aspects of the business. We have to pressure. I think we have to have specific KPIs for governments and also for business to seek really ambitious targets.
Thank you so much. And I would like to thank all four of you for joining our discussion today, and of course for the work that you're doing in your respective fields and areas and driving this vision forward for it to become a global reality. So a big thank you to all of you.
Thank you also.
Thank you, Geraldine. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Geraldine, and all of you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks everybody for the discussion. Goodbye.